These are the cheapest brake pads I could find on the internet, just $5.99 a set. And these are the most expensive brake pads I could find, at £40 a set. Do expensive brake pads that cost 6 times the price actually improve your braking performance, and how do they compare to the cheapest option out there? This is cheap versus expensive brake pad. Your brakes are one of the most important safety aspects of your bike, because without them, you're just going to crash into stuff. But the brake pads are actually a consumable part, which means the more you use them, the faster they'll wear out, which means you get to a crossroads in your choices. Do you go for a cheap brake pad and accept it might not work as well or last as long, but because it's cheap, you're happy buying them more often? Or do you go expensive in the hopes they work better and last longer because they've cost you a truckload of cash? Well, I want to find out and assess the differences between expensive and cheap brake pads, not only looking at their performance in general riding, but also the materials used in their construction, the technology in their design. I also want to perform an emergency braking test and see which one lasts the longest. Let's start with the most exciting part, the emergency brake test. Now for this test, I'm only going to be swapping the pads out on the front brake. The reason for that is because the front is what does most of the braking for you. I'm also going to be using one rotor for the cheap brake pads and one rotor for the expensive brake pads to try and help make the test as consistent, as fair as possible. I'm also going to be bedding in the brake pads over the same sort of process and distance, again, for as much consistency as we can. So what I'm going to do is ride up to this cone at 40 kilometers an hour, brake as hard as possible using the front brake only, and then measure out my stopping distance. I'm going to repeat this test 10 times for the cheap brake pads and 10 times for the expensive brake pads. And then simply the winner is going to be the one with the shortest stopping distance. Right, cheap brake pads are fitted into my bike. Let's go. Cheap brake pad emergency test, done. Average stopping distance, 10.18 meters. My time did decrease as I went through the test, so we'll see what happens with the expensive pads. Let's get the expensive brake pads in, repeat the test. Expensive brake pads next. At 6 times the price, I'm hoping to be blown away by their performance. Oh. Okay, results time. Cheap brake pads first. We had an average stopping distance of 10.18 meters. Expensive brake pads next. Average stopping distance, 8.41 meters, which means we have a difference of 1.77 meters, which might not sound like much to you, but it is fairly significant in my eyes, and it's the difference between stopping either here or here. Now in an emergency situation, that could be the difference between going into the back of a car or another rider or not, which I think is particularly important. Now next, I want to discuss general braking. Now, granted, not the most thrilling subject, but an important one nonetheless. Now, a key characteristic is brake bite. This relates to how effective the brake is upon initial application in terms of then translating to slowing you down. With both brake pads well and truly bedded in after the emergency brake test, I think now is probably a good time to discuss that initial brake bite. But before we do that, I want to highlight that the expensive brake pads have pretty much generated zero brake dust, meaning everything's slightly neater and cleaner. The brake bite is completely subjective, and out here in the real world, most people would struggle to tell the difference. But I'm gonna say the cheap brake pad has a little bit more bite to it. Now, is that important to you? Probably not, but for some people, yes, particularly people with smaller hands who perhaps struggle to apply much force at the brake lever. So choosing a brake pad which has got more brake bite to it is going to help you out and is going to help make you feel more confident on the bike. Now, the factor that affects how much brake bite a specific brake pad has is down to the makeup of the friction material. So let's discuss that next. Now, broadly speaking, the friction material can be split into two different types. You have resin and metallic. But there are other options too, such as ceramic, which is what I've got as the example of our expensive brake pads here. And there's also semi-metallic. By adding ceramic or metallic fibers into the braking compound, you can improve longevity, you can improve the pad's ability to deal with heat and improve its performance in the wet. But by adding these ceramic or metallic fibers, it's going to have a negative impact on brake bite. So it's worth taking that into account when you're choosing what type of brake pad you want to purchase for your bike. It's also worth noting that in 2025, there are planned regulation changes to limit the use of metallic fibers used in brake pads in order to try to help the environment. So it's likely that we're going to see developments and changes in, say, ceramic materials or the resin brake pads as well. Now, predominantly these changes are going to affect the automotive industry, but it is going to have an impact on the bike industry too. It's also important not to overlook the backing plate. So this is the piece on the back that the friction material is bonded to. Now, interestingly, neither the cheap or expensive brake pad examples I've got here have the cooling fins on them, which we associate with the original equipment manufacturer, which is supplied on most of our bikes. Now, initially, I thought that neither of these pads had these on it because it was to do with the additional costs for simply manufacturing a pad with additional features to it. But I've spoken to the guys at AMP to ask them why they didn't put that onto these expensive brake pads, because you think at £40 for a set, you should have the ability to add cooling fins on if you wanted to. And they said that in their testing, they found the cooling fins really didn't have a significant impact on the cooling of the brake under harsh braking conditions, so they decided to forgo that feature in order to make the brake pad as light as physically possible. And it kind of makes sense really when you think about it, because the goal here is to limit the transfer of heat from the brake pad across to the caliper. And if you've found that the cooling fins aren't doing much, you're best off looking at choosing an alternative material that is going to conduct heat in a slower way. So, hear me out, right? So on the cheap brake pad, we've got an aluminium backing plate. Now, aluminium conducts heat incredibly well, which is going to draw it away from the friction material, which is good, but then it could easily transfer across to the brake caliper, which is bad. So what the expensive brake pads have done here is it uses a combination of an aluminium backing plate combined with carbon fiber. Now, carbon fiber is actually a really great material to use in this situation. It conducts heat 40 times slower than aluminium and is in fact not really listed as a conductor at all, more of a heat insulator. Now, this technology might not seem that important to you, and perhaps for general day-to-day riding, it's maybe not crucial. But if you're someone who works the brakes of your bike particularly hard because you ride fast, or you're racing, or you're a heavier rider, or perhaps you live in a hilly area, technology like what's used in these expensive brake pads is going to be helpful when it comes to managing those higher temperatures. Brake pad torture test next. Each of the brake pads are going to go onto the mini belt sander. We've got a 60 grit abrasive belt on here, which is going to wear the brake pad out, and we can see which one wears out the quickest. Right, let's go. Brake pad torture test. Done. And it would appear that through that 5-minute block of testing that we did, the cheap brake pad has almost worn completely down to the metal blacking plate in a couple of areas. And if we compare that to the expensive brake pad, well, it has worn it down, but nowhere near the same amount. If we look at even the lowest point here, it's perhaps only worn around half of that friction material away, which I'm going to say has surprised me quite a bit. Now, let's be super clear on this. Testing using that belt sander isn't exactly replicating real world conditions, but it does show that in theory, the cheaper brake pad has worn down at almost twice the rate of the expensive one. So you would assume out in the real world, the expensive brake pads could potentially last almost twice as long. Now let's run through some of the tests that I've done today. So the emergency brake test, well, that went to the expensive brake pads. A difference of 1.77 meters. The brake bite and general brake feel actually went to the cheap brake pad, presumably down to that resin material giving a little bit more brake bite. And then the pad technology and construction, well, I think I'm going to go with the expensive brake pad here. We've got a ceramic friction material, we've got carbon fiber used in the backing plate, and if you're a real sort of bike nerd and weight weenie, these brake pads are actually 4 grams compared to the cheap brake pads, which are 8 grams. And then, well, we've just gone through the results of the brake pad torture test and shown that the expensive brake pads could well last up to almost twice as long. So overall, my very rudimental testing has shown that expensive brake pads have come out on top. But like all of these cheap versus expensive comparisons, it is really easy to overlook that middle ground, which in many cases simply offers a little bit of the best of both worlds. But the brake pads are just one piece of the puzzle. There's also the rotor design, the rotor size, the caliper design, and perhaps the most crucial part of all is that I believe your tyre type and the setup of your tyre has the biggest impact on brake performance overall. Because I have a feeling that almost regardless of how amazing and upgraded your brakes are, if your tyres aren't up to the job, then it's all going to be a complete waste of time. So I am going to investigate this further to find out what factors to do with your tyres actually affect the brake performance and how that could be the limiting factor. So if you want to make sure you can see that video when I filmed it, well, subscribe to GCNTech and turn on your notifications. And also, if you have enjoyed this video, give it a big thumbs up and get involved in the comments section down below and share your experiences with the GCNTech community. Have you tried expensive brake pads? Have you tried super cheap brake pads? And how have you got on? Right, that's enough chat about brake pads for me. I'm out of here. See ya.